US President Donald Trump and Russian leader Vladimir Putin failed to reach a breakthrough on a Ukraine ceasefire during their 2-hour phone call. Trump, though, struck an optimistic note, saying Kyiv and Moscow will immediately begin negotiations, while Putin's more guarded comments signaled that he hadn't softened his maximalist demands. European leaders, meanwhile, were reportedly stunned after Trump briefed them on the call. He indicated an unwillingness to exert more pressure on Moscow and suggested that Washington could step back as a mediator in the war. In fact, a leading Russian expert has said Putin has devised a way to offer Trump an interim tangible outcome from Washington's peace efforts without making any real concessions. Nina Maria has more for us from Washington, D.C. But first, listen to what Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin had to say.
Did you ask President Putin to meet with you?
About what?
About Ukraine.
Of course I did. I talked to him about it. I said, when are we going to end this, Vladimir? I know him for a long time now. I said, when are we going to end this bloodshed, this bloodbath? It's a bloodbath. And I do believe he wants to end it. You know, when I made the call, I told the people last night, I spoke to the heads of the different countries. But I said to them, we got to get going. And I did say also, if I thought that you couldn't do it, I'd step away, because what are you going to do? We don't have boots on the ground. We wouldn't have boots on the ground. But we do have a big stake.
States set forth his position regarding the cessation of hostilities, and the truth, on my behalf, that Russia also wants a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine crisis.
Well, US President Trump sounding extremely optimistic on the back of his phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. I don't think that President Trump can afford at this point in time not to sound like there's some forward momentum. He said last week that nothing would happen until he and President Putin had spoken. So in the very narrow scheme of things, that's a mini triumph. It's a mini victory. But it's also possible that President Trump believes that by injecting the right tone, it gives the lack of progress a kind of a shiny wrapper on a rather disappointing parcel. Since there has been no movement, we know that there's been no progress, there is no ceasefire, nothing's really changed, except that President Putin and President Trump have spoken. President Trump referenced on the back of that phone call with President Putin a possible trade angle, and we know that trade and investment deals are very much President Trump's thing, which, given the fact that he is capable of injecting a degree of chaos into trading relationships with partners, it does seem counterintuitive. But given his track record of cutting deals, especially if you look at his latest trip to the Middle East and the deals that he's been cutting with Gulf states, it's certainly a language he speaks, the language of trade and investment, and a number of foreign governments are lining up to offer President Trump deals in the hope of better preferential treatment. In particular on Ukraine, defenders of the minerals deal say that it's crucial to securing Ukraine's post-war recovery, that it gives Ukraine sovereignty over its natural resources, and the US on the whole sees critical mineral supply chains, whether or not critical minerals are really there in Ukraine or not, as a way to move away from China. Trade incentives for the US with Russia, a little bit harder to decipher, given President Trump has to strike a balance between sanctions and a transactional relationship. But worth saying that European allies, however divided they might be over Ukraine at times, do not share President Trump's tone of optimism coming out of this call. Nina Maria Potts for NDTV in Washington.
Well, for an expert's view on the matter, joining us this morning, Daniel Block. Daniel, always a pleasure to have a chat with you and have you on NDTV. Trump, in typical style, says the call went very well. But are there any concrete signs that negotiations between Russia and Ukraine are actually about to begin? Or is this yet another diplomatic mirage?
I think this is yet another diplomatic mirage. Now, it's worth noting there have been conversations between the Russians and the Ukrainians going on, and it led to some prisoner swaps, So there is some diplomatic communication between the two parties, but the word I think you used at the beginning, which is right, is typical. We've seen this play out now since Trump has taken office. He has some interaction with Russian President Putin. They have a conversation. Trump comes out. He declares some kind of victory. He says that we're moving closer to peace, and nothing changes.
Right.
The war goes on. And I see no indication that that's about to change now.
Meanwhile, Putin still insists on addressing the root causes of what he calls a conflict, which many say is code for control over Ukraine's sovereignty. Has there been any indication from the Trump administration about what they're willing to entertain or compromise on?
Well, the Trump administration has sent out so many conflicting signals about what it's willing to entertain or compromise on that it's really hard to discern. I think you're exactly right, though, that we have a situation where what Putin wants is control over most of Ukraine. That's his end goal. That's his desire. And he's willing to fight on until he gets it. And that's really why we're not seeing any momentum toward peace. For Putin, peace is capitulation by Ukraine. It's conquest, de facto or de jure. And obviously, that's something that the Ukrainians are never going to accept. And so long as those are the two demands, there's not going to be any peace between the two parties, no matter how hard Trump or his administration tries to finagle or negotiate some sort of ceasefire.
And a quick also pulse check from Washington, Daniel. How is this call being perceived inside Washington's foreign policy circles? Is there relief, skepticism, or is there concern about what Trump might be promising in private?
I think it depends on the circles. So there's obviously some very pro-Trump foreign policy circles where, for lack of a better phrase, the president can do no wrong.
Right.
And I think in those circles, there's continued excitement and continued celebration about the diplomatic contact between the United States and Russia. Maybe some hope that there will be momentum that picks up and leads to an eventual breakthrough. But I think among the foreign policy mainstream, as it were, among most foreign policy commentators, analysts, and former practitioners, there's skepticism and a sense of dread, a feeling that this isn't going to go anywhere, a feeling that we're no closer to peace, but the war will just grind on, and that all that President Trump is doing is slowly sacrificing American credibility and in some ways weakening America's partnerships with its European allies.
Right. Well, given Trump's unpredictable diplomacy and, on the other hand, Putin's strategic rigidity, we will wait and see if any real breakthrough is possible here. Daniel, as always, thanks so much for joining us on NDTV.